Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint and Office 365 community webinar. My name is Maureen and I am delighted to be joined by Jeff Reed, who will be talking to you about understanding the new SharePoint Fabric impacts your intranet project. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag ESPC16. There will be a questions and answers session at the end of today's webinar. Type any question you may have for Jeff in the questions window. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. And now I'm going to hand you over to our webinar presenter for today, Jeff Reed. Hello, Jeff.
Hello, Maureen, and thank you all for coming. I am just going to double check that you can in fact hear me and see something on a screen.
Yep, perfect, Jeff. Take it away.
Fabulous. Well, for this hour, while you're enjoying your lunch, I'll take you through the new SharePoint framework and how it impacts your intranet project. We're seeing a real resurgence in new or renovation, if you will, of intranets and digital workspaces, and it's hard to set your roadmap because Microsoft is coming out fast and furious with new capabilities, and as part of the Future of SharePoint set of announcements now 2 months ago, there's a whole set of capabilities that affect both out-of-the-box intranets and the extensibility of intranets for customizability. So I'm going to give you some perspective that will hopefully allow you to tame the roadmap rather than being swallowed by it. Let me introduce myself briefly. I'm a long-standing search nerd. Actually, I consider myself a general-purpose nerd that became involved with software that understands human language about 15 years ago now, and that includes speech recognition, text analytics, and search. Working in search, which is a passion of mine, brought me into working at Microsoft when Microsoft acquired my company, Fast Search. And that's how I learned SharePoint, I'll say, from the inside of Microsoft, and I fell in love with it. So since that time now, about 9 years, I've been really excited about helping people make the best use of SharePoint and the best use of search and information management within SharePoint. That's included a lot of blogging and book writing and speaking like this webinar. I left Microsoft about almost 6 years ago and joined a Microsoft partner called BA Insight. And I won't be talking about BA Insight on this webinar, but for those of you that are curious, we make products that add onto SharePoint to connect people with the information they need to get their jobs done. And that's been a very satisfying ride, both because we've been able to create some great products and because I've been personally involved in hundreds of projects, hands-on with some of these names and more, which have taught me a lot about the real-world applications of SharePoint and search. And most apropos to this webinar, to their use in intranets. So I'll be talking a little bit, setting the stage on what is an intranet and how are people approaching intranets on SharePoint and Office 365. Then I'll go into the new SharePoint framework and the capabilities that are rolling out for out-of-the-box intranets from Microsoft, finishing up with some observations about how you might think about this as you go through your planning, about both approach and timing for a renovation or a new intranet project. All right, let's get into it. Intranets are familiar to all of us. Almost all organizations over 100 employees have an intranet, but they're often, I'll say, misunderstood because they're not a single thing. People using the intranet need to do multiple things. They need to get information and knowledge, collaborate with others, and have access, easy access to the specialized applications they use in their daily jobs. So know, share, do is a way to think of this. And too often, intranets are misaligned. I had the pleasure of speaking at the Intra-Team conference this spring in Copenhagen, and a organization called Intra2 had a wonderful setup where they, as a part of a community, analyze people's intranet homepages according to this color code of what the homepage is spending pixels on. Because clearly your intranet is a library, a way to know what you know, get at the information, to solve whatever the task is at hand, and a collaboration mechanism. The tools both are part of the intranet, but I'll talk a little bit more. Other function is a news function. And very often, because the most typical owners of the intranet are an HR or a corporate communication function, how the intranet is built and how it's used by employees are misaligned. So this same organization, Intra2, had an exhibit with about 70 intranets, which they'd sampled. And you can look a little bit here on the right of the color codes. One thing that was particularly interesting is this phenomena that almost all of them had a lot of red. In fact, this one was probably the least red, so that organizations in their current intranets are spending half of the space on news, sort of the news carousel, the weather, and that's useful. But in the metrics of how people actually use the intranet and whether those elements get clicked on, it should be a much smaller piece of the pie. So often intranets are misaligned, partially because of ownership and partially because they do multiple things. Just to make it somewhat more confusing, there's a tendency to reinvent terms and broaden terms, and there's a digital workplace term. One of my favorite organizations is the Digital Workplace Group. If you're not a member, you should take a look at it. They have fabulous material, including roadmaps for how to plan out a digital workplace initiative. But this is an illustration really of the line, if there is one, between I'll say a traditional intranet where you think of this as policies, relatively static published information from a corporate perspective, including perhaps a corporate directory, to today's intranet, which includes collaboration, social networks, news, the ability to perhaps fill out your time card, look at vacation policies and benefits, and self-service applications. And then a ring out from there, which is the digital workplace of all of the things you need to do to get your job done from wherever you are. So the intranet can be anything in the spectrum, but most typically today I'm seeing these things that are in the advanced intranet ring with a little bit of dipping into things like external collaboration tools, productivity suites, unified communication, and search. There's another organization that I would refer you to in terms of trends, the Norman Nielsen Group, which has been looking for over a decade at the features and trends, which you can see here on the left, where a emphasis on brand and design is a huge upswing in terms of how people are deploying intranet. And then use in terms of blogs, publishing, emphasis on search, and things like mega menus and fat footers. These are the top trends over the last 3 to 4 years. The other interesting element for this audience in particular is that SharePoint is not only the most popular platform for intranets by far. 8 out of the 10 quote-unquote best intranets in Nielsen surveys this past year, or this year, have been on Office 365 or SharePoint. You can see that the new platforming lags the release of new versions of SharePoint by a year or so. So Office 365 is just starting to get into the running, if you will. And you'll see Microsoft sometimes saying 9 out of the 10 top intranets are built on SharePoint. That's where this data comes from, although this year it's 8 out of 10. The other perspective that might be useful is that the time spent creating intranets has sort of this lumpy trend that at the turn of this decade, we reached sort of a peak as customized intranets became very vogue, fit to feature, and those tend to take a long time. I think with the pace of business these days, a 6-year project to deploy an intranet just would not fly. So that decreased rapidly with increased use of platforms and pre-built intranet packages to where we sort of are today, which is still that it takes over a year to refresh your intranet. So as you're getting into it, think about your options, and this length of time and also the expense, which is averaging about 600,000 euro for an intranet refresh project, have been a big concern for many organizations. They need an intranet, but the time, expense, and risk can be daunting. So there are 3 predominant options. One is to use SharePoint or Office 365 out of the box as an intranet. The second is to add on packages that include a number, and I've counted in the last year 18 new intranet in a box products and packages. And the third path is a, if you will, a full custom implementation. In fact, there's a whole spectrum from configuration, just setting web part settings, tailoring of adding in components or styling branding, etc., adding extensions to full custom. But the way most of my customers see it is these sort of three options: out of the box, full custom, and then something in between, which often is adding products. And with SharePoint and Office 365, there's a lot of possibilities. In fact, because there's so many options and tools and they are changing, Office 365 is very much like this crazy Swiss Army knife. And the tool that you need is probably in there. It's really a matter of finding it, applying it well, and keeping focus on that and taking the nail clippers out of the equation. So if you're interested in sort of the feature function fit of Office 365 as a suite or a bundle to intranets and digital workgroups, I've done a couple of webinars and recordings on this subject. You can look on the BA Insight website for a webinar we recently did about using Office 365 for the digital workplace. But at a high level, there's pretty much all of the capabilities that you need functionally to provide an excellent digital workplace, which is a superset of the intranet, plus the ability to configure and extend across a suite of components, including Skype, Yammer, SharePoint Online, Exchange, OneDrive, and much more, tied together with a relatively new notion of what's sometimes called the 3 Gs, groups, graph, and governance, and I'll be touching on those. So the reason that so many people choose to build an intranet on SharePoint is because of this breadth of capabilities and the sort of pre-integrated nature of them. However, SharePoint and Office 365 are changing really fast. We're no longer on a 3-year cycle on-prem. We're on a monthly cycle with some recent very big news. And if you have not been sort of following this sort of future of SharePoint rollout, it's pretty comprehensive. There's a lot of good blogs from the European SharePoint conference community, and I won't go into most of this in depth, but there's 4 main pillars. One in file sharing, which is really around OneDrive, a big push on security, privacy, and compliance, both online and on-prem, and then mobile and intelligent intranets and developer tools, including no-code development, things like Flow and Power Apps. There's a ton of updates which are rolling out quite regularly, and as we now get into talking about the SharePoint framework, it's really the right-hand side, the right 2 pillars that I want to focus in on. The SharePoint framework itself is part of this open and connected platform, quote-unquote, pillar, but to understand the impact of it on your intranet project, we should start with what's out of the box. And what's out of the box as part of this new initiative is a lot. At a very high level, rather than SharePoint and SharePoint Online being a platform that no one really should use out of the box, right? The top statement I hear from my clients is, I want to use SharePoint, but I don't want it to look like SharePoint. There's a tendency to roll out an out-of-the-box SharePoint as an intranet today and fail because it doesn't have a good user experience and is missing pieces for completeness. So Microsoft is working quite hard to establish a intranet that you can use out of the box. And one of the areas that has been lagging in SharePoint is mobile. There's a new SharePoint mobile app which is released about 2.5 weeks ago as a preview for iOS first that has a native app. I use it and find it for the purposes of sites and navigation quite good. And you can read all of the pieces here. This is straight out of Microsoft's announcement, if you will. And a couple of highlights as it relates to how you might think about your intranet project. The first is that intranets are multiple pages and multiple destinations. So the new SharePoint home, if you go into the waffle here, you'll see that there's you'll see that there's a SharePoint tile, which was previously called Sites, and that has your frequent uses, your destination sort of bookmarks, along with what you've been doing recently in this card format, as well as things that are suggested because you're connected with them through people you collaborate with, they're trending around you. That intelligence is coming from the Office graph, which is most often known through sort of the delve view on it, as you can see has a sense of popularity, as well as an ability to navigate around through, who's doing what they're working with, see, and this delve experience, which has now been out for over 2 years, has passed the 10% utilization mark in SharePoint Online, which is actually quite good. Might sound low, but it's at first people didn't really quite know what to do with delve. Now that's really seems like it's catching on, and this same intelligence is being used within sites and within an intranet setting out of the box. The search capabilities from that are now spreading throughout every element of Office 365 and include content, people, and sites from throughout O365. So the whole suite is both getting brought together, and search, which is my home base, if you will, as a unifier, is very present. Now, one of the critiques of SharePoint for an intranet historically has been that it's really got a lot of features for small teams, but not a lot of capabilities for, if you will, the primary home page. As you can see, when I go to my own homepage on BA Insights intranet, we've essentially bypassed all of that by having our primary page be search. And that's partially because it works well to have highlight search as a destination almost, but also because the out-of-the-box capabilities for your homepage, especially to a corporate communications person, have been weak. What's rolling out from Microsoft are a lot of capabilities, in particular getting at this weakness through a page builder, which allows you to build up a page, drop in parts, pull in pictures quite easily, use the web parts, which are a familiar paradigm, so that doesn't really require an IT person to work with, and then have it show up in a mobile view. So it's a very nice experience, both for publishing from a corporate communication standpoint and for blogs by executives, by other folks, as a more casual and often more informative tailored set of publishing. If you make it really easy for people to capture and publish information they care about, that's a real way to get reuse and communication. And the rollout of the mobile and intelligent intranet, as announced 2 months ago, looked like this. And I'll say that it's been on track or ahead of schedule, so that all of the elements in terms of new lists, new document libraries, new site activity and insights are in first release now, and rolling out in a general sense. And some of the things due in we're already in H2. A lot of these things have also hit in first release, so that the question of whether Microsoft is going to hit schedule is a perennial one, but so far so good. So we've talked about the out-of-the-box intranet very briefly, and the buzzword bingo of a mobile and intelligent intranet. Let me hone in on the SharePoint framework, and this is part of the open and connected platform. Just as a background, the way of tailoring and developing with SharePoint has evolved. Well, it's really had almost a new model every couple of years. But many of the traditional approaches that people are familiar with, although they still work in SharePoint 2016, are no longer quote-unquote recommended. Right? All of the farm-level solutions obviously don't work in Office 365. It's not recommended to use master pages or the custom .NET parts and pages. And as a developer, my hands are tied in this realm. I'm trying to make things that work both online and on-prem and in hybrid. And the add-in model, which was introduced about 3 years ago, is very safe, but also quite limited. And therefore, that's evolved into this new SharePoint framework. And at a high level, the SharePoint framework is client-side development, right, which means the action is happening in the browser, less processing on the server, built-in applications that can work off of lists. Therefore, almost everything in SharePoint is lists, libraries, etc., and work as either client-side web parts, because the web part paradigm is very familiar to people in SharePoint and also very effective for those that aren't developers, for tailoring, if you will. and also page-based applications. So you're no longer restricted to working within an iframe, within a fixed window. You can control the whole page with a new page model. There's also a webhook API, a way to get events, alerts, and therefore be proactive. And this is strongly touted as the future of SharePoint development. It's not available yet to people outside a handful of folks that have been to Development Kitchen, which I very much enjoyed. But you can get more depth information from patterns and practices and from this this webinar. So the key thing to know is that this is the first time that I've really seen Microsoft use this same framework to roll out all of the new pages and capabilities that I just talked about. So the page builder, the sites, document libraries, the publishing framework, the Delve profiles, sort of the new My Sites, and the upcoming new team sites are all built using this same framework, and the majority of it is open source. So it's very different from a robustness and rollout perspective because Microsoft is using it and they're also sharing it. The two key elements for, I'll say, professional developers and custom intranets or extended intranets, as well as those of us like BA Insight that make add-on products, are the APIs, and that's coalescing in a graph API that gives access to all of Office 365. And yesterday in Dynamics, there was also an announcement of Dynamics 365, which brings then in CRM, ERP capabilities or tools, not yet into the graph API, but into a common set of objects. And then the UI development framework, which is the SharePoint framework. So through that framework, you can call the Microsoft Graph, you can call to other cloud services, and the couple of nice things about it are that it's backwards compatible. It will continue to work with, if you will, classic web parts, and that it is automatically mobile. So this SharePoint mobile app, which today is fine, but seems kind of limited. You can look at lists, you can look at libraries and sites, and those views are pretty and effective, but you really want to get it more. Everything that you write with the SharePoint framework will work in the SharePoint app. So you write it once, it works on-prem, online, and mobile. Three real elements, and this is actually a slide courtesy of Victor Van Lien, are a page and part model, the use of quote-unquote modern web stack, JavaScript, TypeScript, and the fact that both Microsoft, meaning first party, and third parties, partners, integrators, and enterprises can write their own pieces with exactly the same APIs. Those are really the key parts. And the page model, you can see in any of the more modern pages. Because it's made to work in the SharePoint app and be responsive, and because it's intended to work as a really pretty experience out of the box, the Chrome is much more limited, and the branding is done within that Chrome. And then within the page body, otherwise known as a canvas, you can place web parts much as you've been familiar with doing all along. And that's a one of the reasons that SharePoint is so popular as a publishing or portal technology is that ability to place interchangeable parts quite easily, so that remains in this page model. But the out-of-the-box parts now include things like the authoring experience that comes with the out-of-the-box page builder. And if you are a developer, there's a lot to learn, and I highly recommend there's a series of things from Microsoft Pattern and Practices about how to get started, what tools to use. This is a very different development cycle and development tooling than you've ever seen in SharePoint. And it's shared with Office apps along with lots of things that are not Microsoft at all. So at BA Insight, we use Angular. We have a member who's passionate about Ember. Does that Ember work? Yes. Most of the tooling you see here is open source, and the distribution and the pace of development is much faster. For me personally at BA Insight, it's also changed my recruiting profile. I no longer have to find someone that's a .NET expert with 10 years of .NET that then know SharePoint and teach them search. I can take people straight out of school that know JavaScript and have good logical thinking, and they can be productive very quickly. So if you are an enterprise, that also helps you because the barrier to building things is much lower. There's two main application types with the SharePoint framework. One is client-side web parts, very similar to the web parts you all know and love, and in fact interchangeable in that you can use client-side web parts in classic pages. And then there's client-side applications, which are full-page applications that control everything but the Chrome. And the Chrome is kept consistent for nav so that you really can't break it, and that's a way for Microsoft to ensure that there's always a good sort of quality of service and user experience. So remember these client-side web parts, client-side applications, and the web parts are relatively familiar. The applications are like other client-side applications if you've ever worked with Salesforce, etc., but they really give you full control. And this is trusted code, which means that you can do things that you simply could not do with add-ins. So as I mentioned, in these client-side application experiences, the ones that are out of the box, including Video Portal, the Delve blogs, OneDrive for Business, those all use SharePoint framework. They use part of the SharePoint framework is something called the Office Fabric. So all of the styles, fonts, icons used within Office and SharePoint are now open source. Therefore, you can fit in very well, or change them in this environment. And then, of course, you can do custom experiences with effectively no constraints. And, for example, this is courtesy of Portal Solutions. It's a full custom homepage that then brings in all of these capabilities from Office 365, video, Power BI, etc., to provide a great experience. So that gives you a sense of the SharePoint framework You can read the timing here, and again, this has been so far so good on track. I think the rollout of custom sites and the ability for a wider development community to get their hands on this framework and be ready, that's coming. The other key element is that all of this is coming on-prem. Already I can connect with my SharePoint mobile app into on-prem sites, on an early basis, and that's rolling out quite soon. But providing this whole SharePoint framework on on-prem SharePoint is coming pretty soon. So we've talked about these two pillars, what's out of the box and what's extensible with this SharePoint framework. Let me finish up with a couple of building blocks that are important to understand, and I'll touch on these pretty rapidly. There's a lot more information available, or you can shoot me a line if you want to get deeper. There's three key building blocks as part of this quote-unquote new world. The first being groups, and groups are, there's a lot to say about groups. They're fundamentally an identity function that lives in Azure Active Directory, but with the ability to create and share groups from any of these surfaces. And you can see that groups are wired into most of the elements of Office 365 already and getting wired up to more and more, so that groups are a fundamental construct. When you create a group, you also create a group mailbox. You create something that's behind the scenes now but will be surfaced pretty soon, a new team site. You create a Yammer group. You can use groups in any of the you also get a OneNote notebook. So it's a really nice facility, especially for small groups and teams, which is a pretty common need for any collaborative experience, especially intranet. The second G is the Office graph. We've touched on this, but beyond what you can see in Dell video, the profiles, the elements that surface today, there's constantly new content being added into the Office graph and new signals, especially around meetings. And as you can anticipate with Microsoft's acquisition of LinkedIn, look for more and more of this as a unifying element, both in Office 365 and I predict in my personal crystal ball into the Dynamics 365 as well. And the third G is governance, and I won't do more than a tip of the hat to this, which is to refer you to the new Trust Center. It's a great way to look up if someone asks about any particular alphabet soup in compliance. There's a single place to go. But more importantly, there's been a major initiative behind making all of this both manageable but also secure, private, and compliant. And that's not something users will necessarily see in their intranet, but it's table stakes to make a top quality intranet. So all of these capabilities are now starting cloud first. As I mentioned, the SharePoint framework will work on-prem, but some of the elements like the Office graph will live in the cloud forever. And the path to making those work is hybrid. So almost all of the elements you see on this in Office 365 are now accessible using hybrid SharePoint, which is another favorite subject of mine. We've talked about intranets, the new SharePoint framework. Let me close up with talking about some suggestions about how this could impact your project. Fundamentally, the move towards having out-of-the-box experiences that actually work well, that are modern, that are mobile, and are effective, is pretty new. I think that goes along with having an online service and needing people to actually use the software rather than simply buy it. The mechanisms for tailoring, such as Flow and Power Apps that we haven't really talked about, but also the use of these client-side web parts is much easier. And extension and customization, both in the ecosystem of third-party component providers and in full customer bespoke development, is much easier. So anywhere you are on this spectrum, friction just went down because Microsoft really is learning new tricks. Sometimes I think it's ironic that they say they acquired Yammer in order to learn how to run an online service, and now, in my opinion, Yammer is probably the laggard among that. But it's remarkable to participate in and watch the agility of this big creature in running online services, and it's very satisfying to see how central SharePoint is to that. So if you are in the middle of a project today, don't stop. Just keep going and be aware of the fact that these new client-side web parts will be able to fit into classic pages, and think about perhaps prioritizing the things like mobile that will be much better out of the box, where that fits. If you've chosen one of the ready-to-go intranets, and this is a picture from Velo Intranet, a Scandinavian company that makes an excellent package. There's a lot of value in these, and you'll find two main flavors: those that fit completely into the SharePoint framework and run in SharePoint, and those that use SharePoint as a set of back-end services and control the UI and the experience completely running somewhere else. So take a look at these, and then you need to weigh what will be out of the box versus things that you need to buy or build. And there's two things that I see that people are finding they need to add in any of these spectrums, whether it's out of the box or a ready-to-go intranet. One is connectivity, because intranets are a destination site and most information is outside of SharePoint and Office 365. The second is structure. Most obviously visible in navs, like a mega menu, is a key feature of any of these pre-built intranet packages, but also in information architecture. Let me touch briefly on that. IDC has done a perennial survey of where people's information lives, and it's always shown that people spend a lot of time trying to get at and collate information, about a day a week now. But a huge amount of time spent or wasted trying to get at information that's locked in silos. And nearly 2/3 of folks need to get at 4 or more systems, many regularly access 11 different systems. Things don't just live in SharePoint. They live in line of business systems over a very, very broad spectrum. And I live this every day because BA Insight, as part of our product portfolio, makes connectors to all of these systems and more. And we get almost one new connector that we do a month because this never ends. So the ability to bring in the essential information that lives outside of SharePoint or Office 365 is a key thing for any intranet project, certainly any one of scale. When you do that, information from these connectors into Office 365 also will show up in Delve and the Office Graph. And this is a new area that I'm really excited about. We were privileged to win the European Community Awards in this area last year, and there'll be a white paper with the European community up about how do you get information into Office 365 from other sources. The other thing I would suggest is you really think about how important mobile is to you. I mean, mobile is a huge emphasis of this return to SharePoint. There's currently quite a number of add-on products, and most of the ready-to-go intranet products have put emphasis in having a good mobile experience because SharePoint, frankly, has sucked in this area. But this is probably the primary area where I'd suggest figuring out how important it is to you and whether to look for an out-of-the-box element or look for an add-on, because this is the area that's probably most visibly and dramatically changed. Last but not least, the emphasis on UI leaves off a key part of any intranet project, which is to pay attention to information architecture. And I could do a whole another talk about this, but adding in metadata, and you'll see in the new document library experience, this is a really nice end-user experience, and using content types goes a long way. Whether you are out of the box, extended, a prepackaged intranet, or full custom. So this is the second area that you really will need to add on to provide not just a mobile but an intelligent intranet. And my personal view of the intelligent intranet and what it means, watch this space because I just did I had some fun interviewing people about what this intelligent intranet buzzword meant. So I'll be publishing some videos shortly around that. Is that it's important to be connected because information lives in lots of different silos. That the tag-driven and search-driven experience gives you organization. And you see that in the prevalence of the Office Graph and search within the out-of-the-box experiences, but information architecture and tags is a really important part of it. Just like an intranet needs to do multiple things, it needs to be different for different people, and of course to have a natural and productive experience, including surfacing the specialized tools that I may use that you may not, or vice versa. So the approach we've taken to this at BA Insight is to essentially have a bunch of different add-on components that you can use individually or in combination. Keep those effective as the APIs and versions of SharePoint change. Make sure they work online, on-prem, hybrid, and therefore provide an accelerator. This is not a ready-to-go intranet. Rather, it's a set of components that you can use at different stages in any project. All right, let's wrap up. We've talked about intranets And the mentality of intranets, the prevalence of SharePoint in Office 365. We've covered the new SharePoint framework and its use in the out-of-the-box mobile and intelligent intranet that's rolling out for Microsoft, and some factors in assessing how this impacts your project. Essentially, all of the whole spectrum of use things out of the box, customize, configure, tailor, customize, extend or customize, that's all still valid, but all of them are rapidly becoming easier. You may, in most cases, will need to still add on, whether it's out of the box or pre-customized, however the UI and business workflow is done. Information architecture and connectivity is important. And what I'm talking about in the SharePoint framework is new enough that it's unreleased currently, it's evolving fast, so this may be things that you want to use immediately if you have a high appetite for being bleeding edge, or maybe just watch this space as you make your plans. There's a big opportunity to improve your intranet with this. I think we're at the beginning of a new world, and I'll just advise you to remember that you need to accommodate different modalities, tools, as well as content, and not have your intranet be solely a newsletter and just another silo. If you follow this, then you'll be up in the cloud and running. All right, so I think we have about 5-10 minutes remaining for some questions. Maureen, are you there?
Yeah, I do have a few questions for you, Jeff. What do I tell my boss who just says, I don't want it to look like SharePoint?
That's a funny question. I hear that a lot. You say, yes, boss, because it's easy to brand things so they don't look like SharePoint. And it's also quite important for user acceptance. So, say, yes, boss, and then you go and figure out, well, I can add on things that look nothing like SharePoint but still use SharePoint as an infrastructure. Or I can look to the new out-of-the-box interfaces, which really look quite different than people are used to. And that's a matter of your requirements and time.
Okay, and why are there suddenly so many new offerings for intranet in a box?
Yeah, as I mentioned early on, I've counted 18 new entrants. Many of these come from services companies that have experience making custom intranets and have found packages. And because I mentioned early on that the average time for an intranet refresh project is now 17 months and was as high as 6 years, I think there's a tiredness for the expense and time frame of full custom intranets. By the time you finish them, your world has already changed. So the combination of that need and, frankly, Microsoft being very slow on this front. They announced a next-generation portal initiative a year and a half ago at Ignite, and then were relatively silent about it. It left a vacuum until this disclosure 2 months ago of stuff that's largely already baked. I think that was fertile ground for a lot of new entrants in startups and services companies jumping in with pre-built intranet packages.
And just time for one more final question. Will there be something similar to the page layouts which you can develop for an on-prem publishing site?
The short answer is yes. This new page layout is part of the SharePoint framework and that will come on-prem. My understanding of this is that it will roll out through feature packs in SharePoint 2016. So if you're wholly on-prem, then your path to this is, I think, a little bit slower and more difficult than hybrid or in the cloud, but your path is to get to 2016 and then take a feature pack when it comes out. What's been disclosed is 2017. My crystal ball says it'll be, in the first half of that year.
Okay, brilliant. Jeff, you've been great. Thanks so much.
Thank you all for coming. And if you have any other questions, don't hesitate. You see my email and website on the screen right now. And have a wonderful afternoon.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jeff. So for more top quality training from the world's best speakers, look no further than Vienna for the European SharePoint Conference. That's it for now, but join us again for our next webinar on Tuesday, July 19th.